Welcome to our deep dive, everybody, into African politics. We're using this document you gave us, and it's like, wow, there's so much to unpack.
Oh, absolutely. And it's structured in such a way that it's actually really great for understanding this complex topic. It breaks down the material really well.
So, to kick things off, the document dives right into demographics. And, well, the sheer size of Africa is mind-boggling. I mean, it's the second largest continent, 3.5 times the size of the USA.
Right. It's massive.
And it makes up almost a quarter of all the land on Earth.
It's truly vast, yeah. And the document emphasizes, how crucial demographics are in shaping the continent's political landscape. Like the average population density might seem low, only 82 people per square mile.
Yeah, I saw that.
But that's deceiving. You look at a country like Nigeria,
Oh, yeah.
over 155 million people packed in there.
So demographics are a huge part of the picture. The document also paints a pretty stark picture of the economic realities. Declining GNP per capita, limited access to clean water, high illiteracy rates, and HIV/AIDS impacting things significantly.
Right. It's pretty sobering when you see it laid out like that.
It really is.
But that's exactly why understanding African politics is so crucial.
That's what the document argues, yeah.
Whether it's diplomacy, business, or humanitarian work, understanding the political landscape is key to finding solutions. It's not just about observing these challenges from afar, it's about getting the context.
Okay, so moving on, there's this whole section that asks, why study African politics? It's almost like a call to action, It's like, hey, pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. The academic study of this really took shape in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Oh, right around when so many African nations were gaining independence.
Exactly. It was a time of huge transformation.
So let's go back in time even further to pre-colonial Africa. One of the first things the document does is bust this myth about pre-colonial Africa being a single, uniform thing.
It's amazing how often that misconception comes up.
I know, right? It was so diverse.
Between 900 and 1,000 autonomous political groupings, that's what the document says.
Wow. Each with its own unique structure and way of life.
So the document encourages us to, to appreciate this complexity, to see pre-colonial Africa as this tapestry of diverse political systems.
And it dives into these different types of political organizations. You've got segmented systems.
Right, often found among nomadic groups, like the Somali or Maasai.
And then you've got your centralized systems,
Which are more hierarchical. Think of the Oyo Empire in Nigeria or the Zulu monarchy under Shaka Zulu.
Good examples. And, I think it's fascinating how the document connects these different structures to how various groups responded to European colonialism.
Absolutely. It's all connected. Some groups used to more decentralized power structures. They might have been more open to, say, negotiations or alliances.
While others, with a history of strong central leadership, might have resisted more fiercely.
Exactly.
So colonialism, the document, doesn't shy away from the brutal realities of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. It talks about how technological advancements gave Europeans this huge advantage.
Like the Maxim gun, it could fire hundreds of rounds per minute.
And then there was quinine, which helped protect against malaria.
So they had these tools that really gave them an edge.
And it talks about the motivations for colonization too, right?
It does, yeah. Economic competition, the need for raw materials and markets.
A sense of national prestige even, right? Like, we need colonies to show how powerful we are.
Yeah, and the need to employ surplus labor. That was a factor too. The document really pushes us to critically examine the forces that drove European expansion.
Because those forces had a huge impact on Africa.
And it wasn't just about taking control, it was about how they governed these colonies.
Right. Like the British, they often favored indirect rule. They used existing local structures to their advantage.
Very strategic.
Whereas the French, they were more about assimilation. They tried to create Frenchmen out of their colonial subjects.
Yeah, very different approaches.
And the document argues that these differing approaches had long-lasting impacts.
Oh, absolutely. It highlights the challenges imposed boundaries, limited infrastructure development, lack of skilled personnel, and how they all contributed to this reliance on single crop or single mineral economies.
Okay, so we've got the stage set. The scene is pretty bleak. But amidst all of this, the document emphasizes that resistance was growing. It traces the rise of African nationalism to the early 20th century.
Yeah, driven by factors like the desire for self-determination, resentment against colonial exploitation.
And the role of education in fostering a new generation of leaders.
That's a key point, the role of education. It's fascinating how the document connects global events to the rise of African nationalism, the World Wars, the Great Depression.
They weakened colonial powers, right?
Exactly. And it exposed the flaws in their systems.
People started to question the legitimacy of colonial rule.
It gave nationalist movements this opening to gain momentum.
The document gives some examples of resistance movements, too. The Maji Maji Rebellion in Tanganyika.
And the formation of the South African Native National Congress, which of course was a precursor to the African National Congress.
Big players in the fight against apartheid.
The document uses these examples to show the diversity of these resistance movements. It wasn't one single thing, it was multifaceted and dynamic.
So many different motivations and strategies. And as colonial powers began to weaken, the process of decolonization unfolded, but it wasn't always smooth sailing.
It was messy, unpredictable.
The document contrasts the British approach, which often involved relatively peaceful transitions.
With the French experience, where independence sometimes came through protracted and violent struggles, like in Algeria, for example.
Yeah, a very different path.
Yeah.
And the document uses examples like Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
To show the complexities of building stable states after independence.
Not easy.
Especially with the legacy of colonialism, the difficulties of nation-building in ethnically diverse societies.
That's a tough road.
And those newly formed states were incredibly vulnerable to instability and military intervention.
So to really grasp those challenges, the document defines what constitutes a state.
The characteristics: territory, population, sovereignty, international recognition.
It lays the groundwork for understanding how political power functions in Africa.
Right, and it makes sure to differentiate between state, government, and regime.
Because those are distinct things, right?
Absolutely. The document is really emphasizing that these distinctions are crucial for analyzing the challenges facing African nations.
We need to get past simplistic assumptions about power and look at the nuances.
Because those nuances matter a lot. And what's really hammered home in the document is how much the legacy of colonialism impacted African states. You're dealing with artificial boundaries, weak economies, overly reliant on exports.
Yeah, and you've got a lack of experience with democratic governance. It's a recipe for trouble.
Exactly. It's like trying to build something sturdy on a shaky foundation.
Yeah.
And then to add another layer, the document outlines these 3 phases of African state development since independence.
It's a good way to think about it, like a roadmap, how power dynamics shifted over time.
Right. So the document starts with phase 1, concentration of power, which dominated the early years after independence. You see leaders like Nkrumah in Ghana or Nyerere in Tanzania.
Yeah, consolidating control.
Exactly. Often suppressing opposition in the name of development or national unity. There was this idea that you needed a strong hand to guide these newly formed nations.
Right, like a period of nation building, where a strong leader is seen as essential. But the document points out the downsides, too.
It does. That concentration of power could easily slide into authoritarianism, and it often came at the expense of democratic principles.
So it's a trade-off, and not always a good one in the long run.
Right. Then comes phase 2, elaboration of state power.
Things get bigger, more complex.
Exactly. Bureaucracies grow, parastatal organizations are created to manage key sectors.
Oh yeah, the parastatals. Can you remind me about those again?
Sure. They're entities owned or controlled by the state, but they operate with some autonomy. They were often created to manage things like utilities, transportation, natural resources.
The idea being the state would control these vital sectors of the economy.
Yeah. But the document argues that while that was the intention, the reality is they often became riddled with corruption and inefficiency.
So another good idea on paper, not always so great in practice.
That's often the case, unfortunately. And then that leads us to phase 3, reconsideration of state power, which really emerges in the 1980s.
Okay, so by the 1980s, what's happening?
Well, you've got all these pressures building up, both internal and external.
Give me some examples.
Internally, you have economic crises, debt burdens, people are demanding democracy, more accountability.
And what's happening externally?
The Cold War is ending, which shifts global power dynamics. There's more pressure from international institutions for reforms.
So everyone's pushing for change.
Yeah. The old way of doing things, simply concentrating and elaborating state power, it's just not working.
Right. You can't ignore those underlying issues forever.
And the document really emphasizes this shift in thinking. There's this growing realization that you need more than a strong state. You need good governance, transparency, and a vibrant civil society.
Okay, so that sets the stage for where we are today. But before we get there, we've got to circle back to those two concepts the document introduced, the soft state and the collapsed state.
Right, because they highlight just how fragile statehood can be, especially in Africa.
Yeah, soft state sounds almost gentle, but it's not, right?
No, not at all. It describes a state that can't really enforce its own rules. Institutions are weak, you've got personal rule, patronage networks, corruption.
Hmm.
The state just doesn't function effectively.
So it's not a complete absence of government,
Right.
but it's not really working either.
The document uses Chad as an example. They have oil wealth, but because of all this dysfunction, they still struggle with poverty and underdevelopment.
Okay, so soft state is bad. Collapsed state sounds even worse.
And it is. That's where you have a complete breakdown of central authority. The government can't maintain order, provide basic services, or enforce the law. It's chaos. Violence.
I mean, Somalia comes to mind. They've been dealing with that for decades.
Exactly. The document uses Somalia as this case study of what can happen when a state truly collapses.
It's heartbreaking. And the document argues that while outside intervention might be necessary in those extreme cases,
Sometimes.
the only way to really fix it is to address those root causes. Poverty, inequality, political exclusion. It's a tall order.
It is. But these concepts, soft state, collapsed state, they force us to think about why some states succeed and others fail.
Right. And they remind us how crucial effective governance is.
Absolutely. Now, as we transition into talking about nationalism, it's important to remember this context, this struggle for independence, the challenges of state building. They were all deeply intertwined with the rise of African nationalism.
Okay, so let's talk nationalism.
Yeah.
The document makes this point that African nationalism was different from European nationalism.
Right. European nationalism was often about unifying people based on shared language, culture, ethnicity. It was all about those commonalities.
Makes sense. But African nationalism was a response to colonialism.
Exactly. It was about taking back power, reclaiming agency from European powers. Imagine this tapestry with all these different colors and textures, each one representing a different ethnic group, culture, language.
I like that.
Colonialism tried to impose this single dominant color on everything.
And African nationalism was like, nope, we want that original vibrancy back.
Exactly. It was about reclaiming that diversity.
Beautiful analogy. The document also points to some key factors that fueled this rise of African nationalism.
Well, one big one was the emergence of this new generation of African leaders. They were educated in Western schools, exposed to these ideas of self-determination, democracy.
So they came back home with new ideas, a new vision for their countries.
Yeah, and a burning desire for liberation.
Think of leaders like Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Nyerere. They all fit that mold.
Another factor was resentment over economic exploitation. People seeing their resources extracted, shipped off to Europe.
While they themselves remained impoverished.
Exactly. They wanted a greater share of the wealth, a say in how things were managed.
It's like being told, you can work in the kitchen, but you can't eat the food.
Right. And then, of course, you have global events like the World Wars, which also played a role.
They weakened European powers,
Yeah.
exposed their hypocrisy.
Absolutely. It made people question the whole premise of colonial rule.
Like, if you're so civilized, how can you wage these brutal wars?
Right. And all these factors, they create this momentum for change. African people are organizing, mobilizing, demanding independence.
They're using every tool at their disposal. Peaceful protests, boycotts, even armed resistance. Think of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya or the Algerian War of Independence. Those were hard-fought battles.
They were. And the document emphasizes how each country's path to independence was unique. Some achieved it through negotiations, others had to fight for it. It was a long and difficult process.
But ultimately, it led to the dismantling of colonial empires in Africa.
It did. And African nations emerged from this colonial era with this newfound sense of hope and possibility. They were determined to build a better future, free from foreign domination.
But it's not an easy road, right? The challenges of building a new nation are immense.
Absolutely. And it all ties back into those 3 phases of state development the document outlines.
Right, that's a helpful way to look at it. So, to recap, we start with concentration of power.
Yeah, those early years after independence, you've got figures like Nkrumah, Nyerere, Kenyatta. They're all consolidating control, often suppressing opposition, all in the name of national unity or development.
It makes sense in a way. You need a strong leader to guide a newly formed nation, build some stability. But like you said before, it's a double-edged sword.
It is. The document is careful to point that out. This concentration of power, it can easily lead to authoritarianism.
Right, it often undermines democratic principles. So then things get more complex as we move into elaboration of state power.
Exactly. The state apparatus expands, the bureaucracies grow, parasital organizations pop up everywhere.
Right, those parastatals. Can you remind me one last time what those are all about?
Sure, they're these entities that are owned or controlled by the state, but they operate with a degree of autonomy. They were often created to manage key sectors of the economy, like utilities, transportation, natural resources.
The idea being to control these vital sectors, keep them in the hands of the state, at least nominally.
Exactly. But in practice, they often become really inefficient and riddled with corruption.
Okay, so not always a success story there. So that brings us to the third phase, reconsideration of state power, starting in the 1980s. There's a lot going on in the world at that point.
Right, you have all these internal and external pressures converging.
So what's happening internally in African nations?
Well, you've got economic crises, debt burdens piling up, and more people are demanding democracy, more accountability from their leaders.
And what's the external picture like?
The Cold War is ending, which changes everything on the global stage. Plus, you have more pressure coming from international institutions pushing for political and economic reforms.
So everybody's saying, okay, the old way isn't working. Time to try something new.
Yeah, and the document points to this shift in thinking as really significant. It's not just about concentrating and elaborating state power anymore. People are starting to see that good governance, transparency, strong civil society, these things are vital for success.
Okay, so that takes us pretty close to the present day, but I want to touch on those two concepts again, the soft state and the collapsed state. They're pretty sobering reminders of what can go wrong.
Absolutely. The soft state is basically a state that can't or won't enforce its own rules. Institutions are weak, often undermined by things like personal rule, patronage networks, and corruption.
So the government exists, but it's not really functioning effectively.
Exactly. The document points to Chad as a good example. They have oil wealth, but they're stuck in this cycle of poverty and underdevelopment because of bad governance.
And then you have the collapsed state, which is even more extreme.
Right. That's where the central authority is completely broken down. You have widespread chaos, violence. It's a really dire situation.
Somalia, unfortunately, is the case study everyone thinks of.
It's a tragic example of what happens when statehood fails.
And the document emphasizes that while outside intervention might be necessary in those extreme cases, the only real long-term solution is to address those root causes: poverty, inequality, political exclusion.
It's a huge challenge.
It is, but it's essential to understand those complexities. So I've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Demographics, pre-colonial systems, colonialism, the struggle for independence, the challenges of state building, these different phases of development, and those sobering concepts of soft and collapsed states.
It's a lot to take in for sure.
It is. But the document we've been using, it does such a good job of providing this framework for understanding African politics. It moves beyond those simplistic narratives we often hear and forces us to engage with the nuances, the complexities of the continent's history and its present.
It really does. It's an incredibly valuable resource for anyone who wants to gain a deeper understanding of this region.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of African politics. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating subject on your own. We'll be back with more deep dives in the future. Until then, keep learning and keep questioning.